Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 218 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, your one-stop shop for all things FCPA compliance related. Today, you're in for a real treat because I have back with me Chris Bauer. Chris is a well-known ethicist and musician extraordinaire. He is going to visit with us today about an article he wrote, which is a 10-point checklist for your 2016 ethics programs. He goes through the list and gives you quite a bit to think about in terms of a checklist and a way to think through some of your ethical issues and your programming requirements for 2016. The episode's a little bit longer than normal, coming in at just over 37 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening. This is Tom Fox. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. We are recording this on Wednesday, November 25th, the day before Thanksgiving, although it will probably be played after that. So happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Happy Thanksgiving to my good friend and colleague, Chris Bauer. Chris, welcome back.
Glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
Chris, you posted a blog earlier this week, I think, that really got my attention. So it gave me pause to give you a call and ask you if you could visit with us about it, which the blog was entitled, or the post was entitled, A Quick Checklist for Your 2016 Ethics Programming. For those who don't know, Chris is one of the leading ethicists we have in the country. He lectures, writes, speaks, talks, and plays music all around ethics. So, what do you think? And I guess a couple of things struck me. One is we really need to think about this, I think, a little bit more often. But two, kind of leading into December, you're already starting the discussion about let's think about how we can incorporate ethics into our overall business strategy and thinking next year. So could you just walk us through your checklist for ethics program?
Absolutely. And as I guess sort of some context for it, an entirely non-business oriented thing got me thinking about this, which is simply the fact that this is the time of year when, everyone begins to get ready to think about making those completely unrealistic personal goals for the coming year. And it occurred to me that, maybe it made more sense to take some time, at least in my business and the businesses with whom I work, to think about what are some completely realistic, doable things that folks can do, not personally necessarily, but in their organizations, that they can put on the list for 2016, that if they just take the time to focus on them and be both conscious and conscientious about it, they can absolutely achieve. So I put together a list of things that, in my experience, are the kinds of issues that I see as the most frequent, most glaring lapses in ethics training, ethics guidance, ethics consultation, and figured I'd just put them out there as, again, sort of a quick and dirty checklist that people could use. And by the way, those of you that are listening to this, if you want a copy of this, just feel free to email me, and I will be happy to send you a PDF of this, and we can just kind of walk through them. And feel free, Tom, to ask any questions or make comments as we go.
Absolutely. We'll get to all your contact information at the end, so if anybody wants this, and I really would suggest that you take a look at this because it really has a wide application to a lot of different things, but with Chris's focus on ethics, it certainly gives you a way to specifically think through some of the things you need to consider. So with that, let's dive right into it, Chris.
Well, here's the checklist. We'll just go through them one by one. They're pretty straightforward, and I think for the most part self-explanatory. But number one, says, and this is, by the way, it's a checklist, so sort of check all that apply. So these are all written in the affirmative. And one is we've attached clear, specific behavioral expectations to our ethics code and organizational values so that employees have an easy time knowing clearly and specifically what's expected of them. And, this one comes from a lot of experience with folks who absolutely swear up and down they've got an ethics code that's clear. You couldn't possibly not know what it means. We have corporate values. Everyone's aware of them. And the realities are that most employees don't really know what the corporate values are, or if they do, they're so vague and non-behavioralized that if you ask an employee, what do you do with that? How does that help you? What in your corporate values allows you to make better decisions? They just don't know. And it seems to me that until you take the step to make sure that everything in your values is both known by employees and number two, behavioralized so they know how to apply them, your work's not done. And as far as the clarity of ethics codes, in my experience, they tend to these very well-intentioned documents that are either actually just policies and procedures, so you might as well call them P&Ps and forget about them as being actual codes of ethics, or they're such broad aspirational documents that no matter how positive sounding they are, they don't necessarily give employees any real clarity about their behavior. Or they'll say, in essence, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't misrepresent who you are or who we are, or don't practice outside of your area of expertise, don't bring shame or embarrassment to this company or this association. And I'm guessing that doesn't help people very much. That to me, that ought to be, assumed coming in the door. I'd like to see folks have ethics codes that really tell people much more clearly, much more broadly what they need to be doing or not doing. So all of that is checkbox number one. Checkbox number two, all employees receive training on both ethics and how to bring our organizational values to life. And I spoke to that broadly a moment ago. The emphasis here for me is all employees get training on both ethics and values. My experience is that training, when it happens at all, typically falls to senior management, maybe to supervisors, maybe to certain management levels. And yet the reality is every employee is in a position to do something that can make or break the reputation of your organization, and to say, well, really, that's just something for managers, just something for our executive board, just something for fill in the blank, whoever you fill in that blank with, really misses the point that effective, practical, applied behavioral ethics training, some amount of it is going to be helpful for everyone in the organization. So that's number two. Number three, there's a live interactive component to our ethics training so that employees can express and resolve any barriers they see to implementing our expectations for ethics compliance and accountability. And this is a tough one in a lot of people's minds. Most people, ethics, in most organizations, ethics training is, you sign off once a year on the code electronically saying, yes, I've read it, yes, I know how it applies, yes, I'll be a good person and won't violate the ethics code. And to call that training, I think, at best is laughable, and in most cases is really destructive. It gives everyone, at least in management, a false sense that people really know what they're doing and why. Anyone can read and sign off on an ethics code, on a code of conduct. It in no way, shape, or form means that they actually really know what it means and how to apply it. And my experience is you go into organizations, say, tell me what your ethics code says, tell me what your compliance plan says, tell me what this has to do with you and your job. An overwhelming majority of the people I ask really have either minimal idea or no idea at all. Part of having a live interactive component is to make sure that there are eyes in the rooms, first of all, just to see. You can sometimes tell who's not getting it, and to make sure they get it. And more importantly, in my experience, is having an opportunity for employees to say, sure, that sounds great, and it looks good on paper, but let me tell you how things really work in our department, or how things really work in my job description, or how things really work with my supervisor. And there are a zillion barriers you run into from people that really would be happy to do what they're supposed to be doing, but see very real barriers to putting the ethics code or the code of conduct into action. And if they have a chance to talk about those barriers, real or perceived doesn't matter, because this is one of those cases where perception is reality. If they have a chance to say, let me tell you why this is tough for me, and you can help them over, under, around, through whatever those barriers are, you're going to get a ton more bang for your buck. And the resistance I hear to this is in small organizations say, well, we're too small, we can't afford the time. Well, you're small, so you can more easily afford the time. In bigger companies, I hear, well, we're too big, we can't get around to everyone. And my thought is the bigger you are, the more important it is to make sure there's a live component, live interactive component, because the bigger the organization is, the more easy it is for things to slip under the radar. So you can come up with 1,000 excuses. Anyone that wants to call me or email me with theirs, I feel pretty confident I can come up with a reason that I'll call BS. There needs to be some live interactive component in there somewhere. You may not be able to do it for long. You may not be able to do it often, but it needs to be in there. So that's number 3. Number 4. And again, one I've somewhat covered already, our leadership and management training programs contain live interactive sections on both ethics and our values. I sort of pulled this one out, separated from the rest, because I'm finding as I get involved more with leadership and management ethics training, and I do more and more of that. I love doing it. And I hear how many leadership and management training programs either have no specific ethics programming component, or it's, read this before the next session, and then there's a 5-minute Q&A, and they move on. Now, thankfully, in the organizations in which I'm doing that work, obviously they've moved past that, otherwise I wouldn't be coming in to work with them. But I hear time and time again in organizations that have very well-intentioned leadership and management training programs that ethics simply isn't covered as an explicit component. Now, in some cases, it's because it's integrated into other training they do, and I think that's terrific. As long as there's an ethics component integrating it to the rest of the curriculum, I think is a terrific thing. However, even there, I think it makes an awful lot of sense to explicitly talk about the ethics component so people begin to think of ethics as something that needs to be a part of their self-evaluation, their organizational evaluation, how it needs to be a filter through which they make decisions as leaders and managers. The next one, our ethics and compliance training is provided to at least some degree to all employees and not solely to executives and managers. Again, I talked about this before. I broke it out as a separate item on this checklist because I just think it's so important. I actually did a couple of posts, Tom. I think maybe you saw these too in the last month that I referred to maybe self-destructively as the myth of leadership ethics training, which many people took to mean something quite different than I intended. My point wasn't at all that leadership ethics training is a bad idea. As I mentioned a moment ago, I think it's critical. My concern is that when you limit it to leadership training, when you limit it to those that are already seen as leaders in the organization, you're selectively pulling back that training from other members in the organization. And I think when you try and conceptualize what is leadership ethics, to me it's a quandary. Leaders, managers, supervisors certainly get called on to make certain kinds of decisions that folks with other job descriptions aren't. So in that sense, yes, I think you can reasonably say there is such a thing as leadership ethics or management ethics. But when you get beyond that and think about what in an organization does an individual need to be thinking about, talking about, being strategic about, how do they need to be making their decisions that reflect an ethical approach, those are no different for everyone in the organization. So I'll say here what I tried to say in a follow-up to those couple of posts, which is leadership and management training absolutely need to include an ethics component. I just think organizations need to not be so stingy about who gets that training. And I think the more everyone gets a similar level of training, I just think it's better for organizations. And, of course, we all like to think, the old saying is everyone's a potential leader. And one way to make good on that old saying is to actually provide ethics training for everyone, not just those that are designated as people that are in the chute for leadership positions in the organization.
Let me drill down a little bit into this because I'm intrigued around the idea or the issue of you differentiate at all between the types of training for different levels of employees or types of employees. So, for instance, is there ethical leadership training as opposed to sort of middle management training or rank and file training, or how would you address that issue?
Well, I see those kinds of trainings or those kinds of labels attached in certain organizations, especially, pretty large organizations. Now, to be fair, I think in some cases they don't necessarily conceptualize ethics as being different, but they just have a track for their management training and a track for their leadership training, and so it's a titling issue more than a content issue. But in some cases, it is a content issue. And the reasons I hear for breaking it out that way is, well, we only have so much time, or and that I can sometimes kind of sort of understand. What I can't understand is when people say, well, we only need to train them in this kind of ethical thinking because they're only going to be X fill in the blank, a manager, a supervisor, something like that. And I think besides the fact that seems sort of insultingly and tantalizing to employees, I think it flies in the face that, again, ethical reasoning is ethical reasoning regardless of what type of job you have.
Right.
And I would maintain that the executive suite and the person on the loading dock pretty much need the same ethics training. Now, again, do they need to be aware of different kinds of situations they might encounter? Absolutely. However, I would also suggest, and I'm going to paint in very broad strokes here, so feel free to call me on it if this is an overly broad stroke, but I think by the time you're really differentiating training in different positions, in different organizational levels, my money says you're probably talking more about compliance programs and ethics programs.
Okay. Well, that really leads into your next point.
It does indeed, which is we clearly differentiate ethics from compliance for our employees while making it clear that we must all focus on both. And this is a conversation I know, Tom, that you and I have had a number of times before, both online and I think in the last podcast I did with you. Perhaps even more over time than in the past, I find so many people confuse ethics and compliance, and usually when they do, they see ethics as just another word for compliance.
Right.
And so one of the things that I find over and over and over in people's writing on ethics, and bluntly, alarmingly persistently when people call me about doing, a keynote or a seminar or some other kind of work with them, they really genuinely think that they're interested in ethics, and it becomes pretty clear, usually pretty rapidly, that what they're really interested in is some sort of regulatory compliance training or speech. And regulatory compliance, is not at all my expertise. And I find the more we confuse that in the way we talk about them, the more both get diluted, frankly. But maybe it's a bias on my part, but at least from my biased perspective, ethics tends to get dramatically more diluted than does compliance. So I think, breaking them out, making it clear to employees that they are different but of equal importance, and in fact, I would say the two together are dramatically greater, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, but I think that's an important differentiation to make. Not just academically, but I think there's very practical behavioral issues involved as well. I mean, we certainly know, there are plenty of things that are ethical and it may not be compliant, plenty of things that are compliant and may not be ethical, plenty of things that are considered ethical and seem to be in line with compliance programming that may be out of alignment with the values that organization have. I mean, I think all three of those are, ethics and values and compliance are kind of a golden triangle, to misuse that phrase. And the conversation in organizations has to continually reference all three. And in that conversation, they need to be differentiated while tying the three together so that they can be as firmly knotted together as possible, just not disappear into one another. I know, when in thinking about barriers to using this checklist, there are really two that come to my mind that I hear regularly, and the number one barrier is what I mentioned a moment ago. It is that people say, yeah, ethics, that's great, yeah, we need to know about that, but really what we need to know about is regulatory compliance. And when you try and create some gravity around ethics, so often it ends up being kind of the red-haired stepchild to compliance. Or it gets ignored altogether because where the gravity is in organizations is in regulatory compliance.
So how does that? Then how does that? I would like to use that really as a lead into your next point, which is how do you leverage both of those concepts into management, which allows management to use the company's existing infrastructure to drive that message.
Yeah, well, I think this is one of those ones that sounds, big and awful and costly and labor intensive, that it is just wildly anticlimactic when you talk about it with organizations. And this is, in fact, that other bit I mentioned a moment ago. The people say, we need to have all this new infrastructure and hire new people and do different things. In my experience, that's a lot of nonsense. Once you get absolutely clear about what your values are and how they translate behaviorally, once you get absolutely clear about what ethics mean in your organization, and again, behaviorally, what the expectations are, once you get clear about what are the compliance mandates that we need to be making sure that we attend to, every organization from a one-person organization up to the mega-sized multinationals all do things that provide opportunities to reinforce every one of those pieces of learning. Every organization does some kind of training. That can be a touchstone for training. Every organization does, counseling and coaching, at least the larger organizations do. Those are already things that you're doing where ethics and compliance and values can be a touchstone. There are performance appraisals in most organizations. That's a formal time, once or twice or 4 times a year, however often you do them, where you're doing a sit-down with employees to talk about, what's going well, what's not going well. Great time to talk about, hey, here's some things I see you doing that really bring our values to life, or some things I see that, you're making some decisions that I understand or don't understand, as the case may be, why you're making them. But let's talk about how we need to be making decisions in this organization because this is what we stand for. Perfect time for doing that. Now, you may or may not be able to build ethics and values and compliance into the formal performance appraisal itself, but it's a conversation you're going to have, hopefully, right? And as the old saw goes, in this case, performance appraisals should never involve surprises, right? It should be a culmination of the other conversations and interactions you've had between performance appraisals. So hopefully you're having those conversations with employees in between performance appraisals, but at the very least, you've got a performance appraisal as an opportunity. You have the most powerful possible opportunity to drive home issues of compliance and ethics and and values in informal conversations. I mean, I think really in some ways that is when you know that you've driven those ideas into the fabric of the culture of the organization, when in the course of informal conversations around the water cooler, literally or figuratively, you hear people say things that reference values, reference ethical behavior, reference attendance to compliance issues, because people are using that, again, as a filter, to use the word I used earlier, for how they make decisions and how they view the actions of other people, how they view the ideas of other people. Now, it may sound kind of, hairy-fairy to say those conversations are going to happen informally. I don't think that's a weird thing to predict at all if they're enough a part of the conversation in training, counseling, coaching, performance appraisals, all that other kind of stuff. And this is one that I actually hold kind of close to my heart. I think if you're abundantly clear about what your values mean and what it means to make an ethical decision in your organization, I think job interviews are a great place to introduce that. I mean, how cool would it be if prospective employees began to learn about your organizational ethics and values literally before day one? You say, let me tell you what really is important in this organization about how we make decisions around here. A, B, C, D. What do you think about that? What's your experience with that? And clearly prospective employees can lie their way through that, like they can lie their way through anything. But number one, they usually don't in reality. And number two, I go back to the same thing. If you end up hiring them, you've already begun the acculturation process before they start their first day. And on that first day, in their training, in their orientation, you start referencing ethics and values and compliance, and just roll that into how people become a member of your organization, ground floor up through senior management. And I think ultimately that's really the goal.
When I read this particular point, and even before you described it for us here, I put this one as really number one, because it was, as you said, having management directly and then throughout the organization send the message of ethics, compliance, and accountability into the fabric of the culture. So I thought this one was, if there is a critical or most critical, this one was right up there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that it speaks to indirectly, and this is another thing you and I have talked about before, both of us, both in writing and I think in the last podcast. I've always been a little unnerved, except in those cases when I've been extremely unnerved, by the extreme focus on tone at the top. Mm-hmm. And not because I in any way, shape, or form want to diminish the importance of tone at the top. There's not much that's more critical. But I think the moment you over-focus on that, which is easy to do, it gets to be really easy for everyone under the top to start making excuses for why their behavior is not what it needs to be. And when you take this approach of saying we're going to build this into our entire infrastructure, the existing infrastructure you already have, it allows there to be much more opportunity to leverage these ideas at every possible level in the organization, in every department, through every job description. And I think that's critically important because there are always going to be people, up, down, middle, that are not doing what they ought to be doing, and either because they choose not to, or in so many cases they're doing a horribly inappropriate thing in exactly the way in which they were trained. These aren't terrible people. They're good people doing wrong things. All of those tend to disappear into the fabric if you're saying, well, we're really going to depend on senior management to be the be-all, end-all for modeling appropriate behavior. Yes, they have to model appropriate behavior. Yes, they have to reinforce appropriate behavior. But the whole goal is to make sure the entire organization is on board. And the more you leverage that entire organizational infrastructure that you already have that is ready-made to do this stuff, the more likely you are to really see a shift in the entire culture of the organization.
And that really leads us, I think, to the next point directly, which is having employees who understand how ethics training helps them make more and better decisions and more easily make better decisions on the job.
Absolutely. And in my mind, this is really at the core of doing effective ethics and compliance training, right? That if it's just do this, don't do that, I mean, that's obviously that's a helpful thing. People need to know what to do and what not to do. But it seems to me, that the problem with that is it makes the ludicrous assumption that there is a policy and a procedure and a compliance guideline for everything, and it's just not true. There are way more things which there are no policies and procedures than things in which there are. And so, the goal is to give people tools they can use to make better decisions more easily on the job that are in line with compliance and in line with the ethics and values the organization says that they have. The example I probably overly use, but it just because it seems to be one that people can understand more easily, is, everyone, or Lord knows everyone, ought to have some sort of policy on gift giving, to and from vendors. Well, that's great. You got to have that. You got to enforce it. But until everyone completely understands, and I mean everyone in the organization completely understands, that that's about undue influence and conflict of interest, my money says it doesn't matter what your policy is written to say. There are 30,000 ways employees can follow that policy to the letter and still be engaged in some sort of conflict of interest or undue influence. So until you're telling people how do you recognize what represents undue influence, how do you recognize what represents conflict of interest, which in my mind is sort of where ethics live, there are just too many opportunities for folks to make bad decisions no matter how much they know what the rules are. And so to make sure that training is helping people make better decisions more easily, I think that needs to be one of the implicit and explicit goals of any kind of training, but particularly when it comes to ethics. And that in itself, I think, sort of sets up the next one, which is our management team understands that ethics training isn't simply a feel-good exercise, but that done right has a clear bottom line financial and reputational implications. I mentioned earlier about how people, often call me, and I'm sure others in the field, saying they want to do some work on ethics, and it turns out pretty quickly they're really talking about, compliance programming. And you begin talking about ethics, and they say, well, yeah, that's nice. Everyone wants to be ethical and all that. But really what's important is we need to make sure we've got a solid compliance program. And, we've talked a few minutes ago, or I blathered a few minutes ago about the importance of making sure both are in the spotlight, and that folks understand that this isn't just a feel-good exercise, but talking about ethics, helping people make better decisions on the job, again, strengthens the compliance program. Like I said earlier, the two together, the whole's greater than the sum of the parts, add in values, and the whole's greater than the sum of the parts. People need to detach from thinking of ethics programming as kind of a kumbaya project, and really make sure they're attending to the fact that if the goal is to reduce and prevent the reducible ethical and legal problems on the job, an explicit focus, organization-wide, if at all possible, is a critical component of that. And I know that sounds kind of preachy, and if so, I'll do my best to be apologetic for it. I don't know that I have that in me. I just think that's a critical thing for organizations to think about, organizations of every size.
Well, I guess certainly doesn't sound preachy to me, but the flip side of that would be you have an organizational component, but you also list specifically a personal or individual employee success component.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are they the flip side, or are they complementary?
I think it's one of the. I don't know if it's the flip side. I think they go hand in hand. I think one of the failures, and I hope I'm not using an overly dramatic word here, but one of the things I hear employees remark about, often complain about, when they talk about ethics training, besides the fact that they just find it unbelievably coma-inducing and unhelpful to them in terms of doing their jobs, is that even when they get it and they say, yeah, that's good stuff, and we buy into it, it's presented as, here's how we can be a better organization. And obviously that's a critical thing, right? We all want to be building better organizations, and our employees are the core of the organization, so employees acting in ethical ways will help make us more ethical organizations. That's all true and all important. But if we just look at the motivation piece and pull that out of the mix for a moment, I think anytime any training, not just ethics, but including ethics, anytime any training can be phrased in a way that is going to help employees be more personally successful in their jobs, you're just going to get more buy-in. They're going to be much more interested, much more motivated, not because they don't want the organization to be successful, but I think all of us as human beings want to be more successful in our jobs, right? We want to know we're doing the right thing, and that's being noticed, and we're getting praised for it, and we may or may not be getting incentivized financially for it, but we're getting the number of pats on the back that we feel that we deserve. And so if you can be mindful of thinking about ethics training and compliance training through the lens of how can we help employees see that this is going to make them more successful at their jobs in this organization, I just think from a strategic standpoint, you're going to get a ton more bang for your buck.
Well, Chris, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but there is one thing that I've really been dying to ask you about, a post you had, and it's actually a Facebook post.
Okay.
And you're the only person I have seen ever post about the debut album of Moby Grape. So tell me about what that album means to you. I love it.
There's a sudden left turn. Absolutely. It was an under-the-radar, groundbreaking album from a stunningly great band that shortly thereafter became an almost equally alarmingly mediocre band. Bay Area, mid-'60s, played a bunch of styles of music that most of the rest of the world, hadn't even heard before. So this is the first album of theirs. They did some stuff that, later would be really identified as being, sounding like Buffalo Springfield. And Buffalo Springfield actually had an album that came out sooner, but Moby Grape was actually performing in that style, at least to my rickety recollection. Before the first Buffalo Springfield album, they did what you would recognize a couple of years later as country rock before anyone else was doing that.
Right.
They had this sort of 3-guitar front that would later get associated with primarily Southern rock, but other kinds of music as well. They have sort of not exactly Crosby, Stills and Young harmonies, but a kind of harmony in some of their songs that were arguably folkier, that again still wouldn't particularly emerge for another couple of years. And all of that is on this one amazing album that, in addition, was produced in a way that it just explodes out of the speakers, especially the more rockin' tunes. And to this day, I love that album. There's a short number of albums that are maybe not at any given time my favorite, but they're always somewhere in that top 10.
Mm-hmm.
And that album, always makes the cut of that persistent top 10.
Unfortunately, I found this group on some of their later albums, and it's as you said, it was a very different sound then. And when I saw your post, I went and looked at the YouTube clip that you had put up, and you're absolutely right. I was not prepared. I sort of thought of them as kind of a Tower of Power type Bay Area sound, and that was not at all what they were.
Yeah, I mean, they had some of that in there just from the sort of, the cross-fertilization around the Bay Area at the time. But yeah, and they did, what today would probably be loosely called sort of jam band stuff for an album or two. But if you ever read the history, they had a sort of an awful history. It's one of those, rock and roll tales that, sort of runs the gamut of almost everything you never want to have happen to a band in terms of management issues and internal conflict in the band and labels that, weren't supporting them, and, money from the wrong people to do music that wasn't really viable. And that first album, if I recall correctly, someone had the genius idea to, if I remember correctly, they released like 5 or 6 singles simultaneously. Even the Beatles were doing 2 at a time, and they didn't all come out at once. So pretty much everything self-destructive or that someone else could do that was destructive to a band happened to them, and it fell hard and fast after that first album. But that first album to me is just remains a gem. Highly recommend.
This has been a great podcast. You gave us a lot of information. You started out by saying that your list is available, so why don't you tell the listeners if they wanted to get your program checklist for 2016 or talk to you about any of the ideas that you talked about here, how would they contact you?
Absolutely. It's certainly, on Facebook, you can get, on LinkedIn, you can get a copy of it and contact me through there. But if you want to contact me directly, which is quite possibly easier, you can reach me by email at Chris, C-H-R-I-S, at Christopher, C-H-R-I-S-T-O-P-H-E-R, Bauer, B-A-U-E-R.com, Chris at ChristopherBauer.com. And, of course, podcasts, having potentially a lifetime, multi-lifetime worth of long shelf life. If you happen to be stumbling onto this podcast in 2035, for better or worse, I'm guessing the checklist is still going to apply. So whenever you're hearing this, feel free to get a hold of me. I'll send you a copy. If there's other ways I can be in any way helpful, be sure you let me know. Thanks a lot, and Tom, thanks again for having me back on your podcast.
Well, Chris, I appreciate it. Always enjoy the conversation, and I hope you guys have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I am pleased to announce my next FCPA Masterclass, which will be held in Houston on January 21 and 22. If you'd like some more information on this, call me or email me rather at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can register directly on my website, Advanced Compliance Solutions, and it also gives you more information. If you need some further information, please get in touch with me. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again.